Good afternoon. My name is Chris Bosick. I'm a faculty member at the Canada School of Public Service, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. Today we are going to be looking at managing employee performance through the easing of COVID-19 restrictions. Wow, we've been living through this pandemic for 6 months or so now. The phrase that keeps coming up is new normal. It's a phrase I've really come to detest. But one thing that does come to mind is this new normal really is constant change. And when I think of the Clerks Beyond 2020 and the emphasis on agility, I keep thinking the last 6 months really is a testimony to the public service's ability to be agile. So we're going to take a small slice of that today. We have wonderful invited guests. We'll have a panel, some scenarios, a couple of presentations, and we're going to walk you through, well, what we need to do to manage employee performance as we ease the COVID-19 restrictions and get back to some semblance of how we used to do business. Before we jump in, just a couple of housekeeping items. So this session is recorded. Recording may be used by the school for future learning activities. Bandwidth can be an issue. You're joining us by webcast. The panelists and myself are joining you through Microsoft Teams, and once in a while the bandwidth gives us a problem. We might lose one of our panelists. I just ask you to be patient. We'll get them back, I promise. And for panelists, if you drop out, please come back. During the event, we'll be followed by a question and answer period. You don't need to wait to the end to submit the questions. We won't answer them until the end, but if you look at your screen, you might have to minimize it, but if you look at your screen in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see an icon. It's somebody raising their hand. Click on that, and you'll be able to type in your questions, which will be passed along to me in the panel. So, without any further ado, the only time we ever use that phrase, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Tolga Yalkin. Tolga is the Assistant Deputy Minister, Workplace Policies and Services at the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. And before I turn it over to Tolga, most of our panelists today are from the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer at the Treasury Board. So henceforth, that will be OCRO and TBS. So I apologize for the shorthand, but now over to you, Tolga.
Thanks for that kind introduction, Christopher. It's really it's a pleasure and actually a privilege to speak to you all today. First and foremost, obviously, because as managers, you play a really critical role, not only in getting the work done that we all do to deliver results for Canadians, but also in managing, coaching, developing and supporting your employees. And it'll be no surprise to many of you that in the current circumstances, the skills that you use to do those things are really being put to the test. You're having to balance the workload while adjusting to the particularities of remote work, and obviously the personal challenges that you and your employees may be facing during the pandemic. And this pandemic has had negative impacts on all Canadians, including public servants, over the past few months. For example, according to recent surveys conducted by Statistics Canada, the proportion of Canadians reporting excellent or good mental health fell from 54% at the end of March to 48% in early May. And I would also point out that this compares to 69% in 2018. On top of the impacts related to COVID, recent acts of violence towards Black and Indigenous people have led to significant media coverage of systemic racism in Canada. And we shouldn't underestimate the emotional toll on our colleagues, whether they are members of visible minority groups or not. Racism, discrimination, and social inequities are all factors that directly impact the mental health and well-being of our colleagues. While the circumstances affecting our people and our workplaces have changed significantly over the past few months, and I would say continue to evolve, workplace mental health has never been more crucial. And these circumstances present, I think, a particular challenge to us as managers. On the one hand, we have to remain flexible in our approach to balancing and responding to them. while on the other, we have to act in accordance with our obligations as managers under the various policies and collective agreements that we're subject to. So today's topic is really geared towards helping you manage in this space with particular focus on performance management. So what are the key takeaways? Well, employees cannot perform their best in a work environment that is not psychologically safe and healthy. And similarly, employee performance won't improve if employees don't feel safe and that their health is considered and valued by their management. As managers, we all play a key role in promoting a respectful, healthy, diverse, and inclusive work culture. And now is really more than ever, in my opinion, the time to ask how things are going, to practice compassion and empathy, and to gain a better understanding of our employees' unique working situations and specific challenges. It's important to remember that the goal of performance management is to create alignment between organizational goals with employee commitments and work objectives, as well as to identify opportunities for learning and development. Especially during these not so normal times, if an employee is having difficulty meeting commitments or work objectives, it's important to take the time to find out why by asking questions about what's going on in their work and how you could help. Commitments and work objectives may evolve and change throughout the performance cycle. And considering your employees' ability to adapt, collaborate in a virtual team, and be resilient is important. And it's important also to be aware that employees may need additional clarity and support during these circumstances. And this, in particular, is a timely opportunity to explore those needs. To support you and your teams during the COVID-19 pandemic and throughout the easing of restrictions, OCRO, as Christopher pointed out in his introduction, and its Center of Expertise on Mental Health in the Workplace has developed a number of resources that are available on our website and that will be shared by participants in this webcast following the event. Before I end my remarks and surrender the microphone to our experts, I want to remind you that the work that you have done under these extraordinary circumstances is greatly appreciated. And in a small way, I hope that the session today gives you additional tools to continue the great work that you've been doing. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tolga. Thank you for highlighting the changes in the people we're serving, the call out to the systemic racism, to the drop in mental health. Yes, these are the Canadians we serve, but I'm really appreciative that you pointed out that all of us as public servants are Canadians as well, and we may be going through that. Our employees may be going through that. And I think you raised a couple of other good points that our panelists will pick up as we go through the rest of the afternoon. You know, we can't do our best if we're not in a psychologically safe and healthy environment, coupled with what you remarked about the average Canadian feeling less healthy mentally right now. You know, the chance to ask how your employees are doing. You mentioned compassion and empathy. I'm looking forward to exploring these in greater detail as we get into the meat of our afternoon. So I'm going to jump over now. I'm going to introduce two more people from OCRO and TBS. We have Kathleen Clarkin and Christopher Lebrun. Kathleen and Christopher are going to talk to us about managing performance in exceptional circumstances, and these are exceptional circumstances. So I'll let you two of you introduce yourself and jump right in. Kathleen, Christopher, over to you.
So excited to be here today. Thanks for having us. Very excited as well to be joined by Christopher to bring the executive perspective, and we can unpack lots more with regards to performance management. So I am the Director of Workplace Policies, Programs, Engagement, and Ethics, and I have the honor of managing the amazing team that is responsible for the Directive on Performance Management.
Hi, and thanks, Kathleen. My name is Christopher Lebrun. I'm the Director of Executive Policy Development within OCRO. My team manages the Executive Performance Management Program, which is guided by the Directive on Performance and Talent Management for Executives. It is also a pleasure to be here today with Kathleen to discuss managing employee performance through the easing of COVID-19 restrictions.
And today our plan to keep the discussion rolling is to sort of try to answer with you three of the main questions that have come up often about managing performance during the pandemic, both from the policy and the program perspective, and how we, in our roles as managers, since we are all living the same challenges as you are as managers, are navigating them.
So the first question is, how has the performance management cycle changed during the pandemic? And we're drawing from our experience with the 2019-2020 executive performance management cycle, which is pretty close to being done. Although the requirements for the 19-20 performance cycle remain the same, certain flexibilities were provided to managers and executives in order to help facilitate the completion of this exercise under these challenging times. In some cases due to things like network restrictions. These flexibilities included extensions to managers and executives to complete their year-end performance agreement and assessment, a performance agreement template outside of the executive talent management system, also known as ETMS, and guidance on how departments could use alternative review mechanisms, such as a secretarial review, to what we are traditionally accustomed to, while still maintaining equity and consistency. The 2020-2021 executive performance cycle is already underway with the performance management agreement module of the ETMS being opened and launched back in mid-July. For executives, the performance management cycle has not changed for 2020-2021. As executives and their managers prepare their commitments and performance measures for the performance cycle, I will take this opportunity to remind executives these are challenging times, and for some, there are continuously shifting priorities. Many executives, like non-executives across the public service, have been working on providing services and delivering programs to Canadians during the pandemic. And all of this work and accomplishments, and these accomplishments need to be captured in the performance management agreements in ETMS. This said, we must align our commitments and performance indicators accordingly, while keeping in mind that these can be modified and adjusted throughout the performance cycle if required. Executives are also expected to demonstrate the key leadership competencies and expected behaviors from those competencies. That hasn't changed. Information and resources on the Executive Performance Management Program can be found on our GCPDF page. It is the Executive and Leadership Development Performance Management GCPDF page. And that page outlines the usual process and any changes to the process, such as the current reality, that have adjusted our guidance and tools, and it's our key way of communicating to departments directly. As we work through this challenging year, and now with the easing workplace restrictions, as well as the mid-year period almost upon us, the performance management process will allow the opportunity to discuss and review learning and development needs, provide constructive feedback, and most importantly, recognition on performance where it's appropriate.
Thanks, Christopher. Like with the executives, we did delay the deadline for completing 2019-20 performance reviews for employees, and we've been encouraging those who've not had regular access to the network to still document their performance assessments and discussions outside the PSBM app. So employees and managers can finalize any outstanding assessments or comments in the app as they either get regular access to departmental networks from home or as they return to the workplace. As for establishing performance agreements for 2021, even though year-end was delayed, we still feel it's important to document work objectives for this year as soon as possible. This is especially important to make sure that all the great work that employees undertook in April and May, well, March too, frankly, but just right to the beginning of April, at the height of the pandemic response is documented and acknowledged. Many employees took on high priority work, sometimes outside of their normal duties, to ensure that Canadians were receiving the support they needed at the beginning of the pandemic, and that work needs to be captured, especially if it was done on other projects or teams. For the mid-year review, you should be planning to go ahead and have mid-year discussions and document them by the end of October to capture all the work that's been done in the first 6 months of the fiscal year. The flexibility remains for those who are still lacking access to the network to document this on paper, but again, I'd encourage you to get as much done in the app as possible. Another thing you as managers should really be keeping in mind as you establish performance agreements and start thinking about mid-year review is to document those employees who've been on extended leave or were part-time working so that their work objectives reflect those arrangements. The expectations need to be aligned to the hours of work, and employees can only be assessed against what's really within their span of control. For example, an employee working part-time can't be expected to meet the same expectations as they would have if they were working full-time. For our second question, Why is it important to continue performance management activities during the pandemic? To begin, from my perspective, the most important outcome of performance management is ensuring employees have a clear understanding of what's expected of them and how their work is contributing to the overall success of their team and the organization. Having clear expectations is much more important than ever in these uncertain times. If an employee's work objectives need to be changed or updated more often to keep pace with the changing environment, having those conversations to set and adjust priorities will build trust and engagement. Regular discussions between managers and employees are really critical for keeping everyone engaged while most of us are working remotely and are missing out on the casual and interpersonal interactions with our colleagues in the office.
Those are great points, Kathleen. And if I may add, performance discussions are also an opportunity for managers to recognize their employees for the work and accomplishments, especially with all the great work that's being done with respect to the pandemic and COVID-19. As Kathleen mentioned, many of us are working remotely and missing out on the usual office interactions. Although the directive on performance and talent management requires 3 periods throughout the performance cycle in which performance is reviewed and discussed, there is nothing preventing managers and executives from having more frequent and ad hoc discussions on performance. Now, I'd also like to talk a little bit about unsatisfactory performance or possible shortcomings of performance during the pandemic. Performance management activities such as action plans are a component to addressing unsatisfactory performance and addressing the issues. Remember, both the manager and the employee have responsibilities in this process. During a global pandemic, employees may be faced with additional stresses and challenges. Ensuring that steps outlined in the directive on performance and talent management for executives and within ETMS are completed helps provide timely feedback and avoids surprises at the end of the cycle. Third question is, what are some of the strategies for effective performance discussions under the current circumstances? I would like to note that previous strategies for effective performance discussions are still very effective and relevant. As we're preparing for mid-year discussions, here are some tips for managers and executives, which can also be found on our GCpedia page. Review the established performance agreement and identify progress towards commitments and performance measures. Review the key leadership competencies, including definitions and the effective behaviors, as performance is not solely about attaining results, but also how they were achieved, as this measures the impact of their behavior on the organization's ability to deliver on its mandate. As an executive being assessed, reflect on your leadership style and the specific steps you have to take during the first portion of the cycle to demonstrate the key leadership competencies. As a manager, reflect on the specific leadership strengths and challenges for those executives during the first portion of the cycle. As I mentioned during the performance cycle discussion, confirm progress against each commitment, considering the what and the how. And after the discussion has occurred, please ensure to document them in the performance agreement of the ETMS.
That's great advice. Thank you. Just to add a bit more, as we approach mid-year, the first step we should all be taking is to confirm with the employees how they want to carry out their mid-year discussions. Find out what platform they want to use for the discussion. So do they have a preference for telephone or video conference? Is there a time that works better for them or a specific day of the week? This type of flexibility will ensure that employees have appropriate notice so that they can plan for the discussion and ensure you can have the discussion at a time and place that allows for a productive conversation free from disruption and can be conducted privately. The handout that we'll be providing does include some additional tips to conduct an effective conversation, and I hope you'll find them useful. The second thing to provide written feedback in advance of your scheduled mid-year discussion so that as a manager, you can also take the employee to help them conduct their own informal self-assessment to outline key achievements or challenges. This really helps set the stage for a productive and positive conversation. Finally, one of the challenges of having performance discussions via phone or video conference is that the visual and body language cues aren't readily available to either party. So it's critically important that managers allow your employee the time to reflect on what's being discussed and check in frequently to confirm a common understanding beyond the official discussion. Ultimately, the point of performance management is to set employees up for success. If you're managing employees who are struggling to meet their objectives, mid-year is a great opportunity to provide that support and make any adjustments necessary to help them get back on track. These are truly unprecedented times we're living in, so it won't be any surprise that some employees are struggling to manage their workload. Before you head down a path to a performance improvement plan, you need to make sure the employee has the appropriate tools to do their job, especially if they're working remotely full-time. For example, do they need a full-size monitor, an ergonomic keyboard, and a mouse? Do they have access to the network and to their files from their remote location? Do you know if they're trying to balance the care of dependents from home? Make sure you have the contact information for the Employee Assistance Program handy, and that the employee also has access to the tools to support mental health and setting up a safe workplace in their home. Thanks very much. I hope you found these helpful.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Christopher. I found them helpful. That's a good start. Again, lots of good points there. The idea of changes to the cycle. It looks to me like the base hasn't changed, but we're making sure that our managers have the flexibilities to really be able to have the conversations with the employees. And what comes out from both of your remarks is that having these conversations really is very important. Making sure people understand, trying to decide, because we don't see everybody, what might be going on behind the video screen or the teleconference call. A couple of great points too about it's not all just about correcting behavior if there's shortcomings. It's about a good opportunity to say, hey, you're doing a great job. And lastly, to check in and see, do you need tools? Do you need support? Because I think that really is the core of our job as managers, is to make sure our teams have the equipment they need, the training they need, the moral support they need to be able to do their jobs, to stay healthy, and to keep on contributing for Canadians. All right, thanks very much. We're going to move on now. Talking about balancing rights and respect. Said that wrong. Balancing rights and respectations, which isn't even a word. Balancing rights and responsibilities, which makes a lot more sense. With us, we have Brian Russell. So Brian, why don't you introduce yourself and then jump on in with what we need to know about rights and responsibilities. I got it right that time.
Thanks, Christopher. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Brian Russell. I'm an acting manager here at OCRO. I work in the employee representation and recourse section. Our team is responsible for everything recourse. So individual, group, policy grievances, unfair labor practice complaints, human rights complaints, and grievances. We're here to help you all as managers and represent the employer's interests before the federal public sector and labor relations and employment board. I think I got that right. In any event, Kayla, if we can have the first slide up, please. If there is one word or one thing that you take away from today, it's the word reasonable. And so in terms of rights and responsibilities, Section 230 of the Public Service Labor Relations and Employment Board Act speaks to the jurisdiction that an adjudicator has with respect to grievances related to unsatisfactory performance. Specifically, any grievance with respect to the demotion or termination of employment as a result of unsatisfactory performance, the adjudicator can only look at the reasonableness of the assessment of the employee's performance. They don't have the authority to look at the reasonableness of the decision to terminate or demote the employee. So put another way, in these types of grievances, the adjudicator can't substitute their opinion with respect to the employee's performance for that of the employer. If we can demonstrate, or if as a manager you can demonstrate that the process to evaluate the employee's performance is reasonable, the adjudicator, their jurisdiction or their ability to intervene, they can only they have no choice but to accept the decision to the decision and the consequences that flow from that. So next question that flows from that, and Kayla, if we can go to the next slide, is what specifically would the board be looking for in terms of what would be an unreasonable assessment of an employee's performance? So the board is looking specifically for the phrase bad faith. So they will, if the performance, if the assessment of the employee's performance is deemed to be bad faith, An adjudicator will jump in and say, well, no, this assessment was not reasonable, and as such, I'm going to overturn whatever decision was made. So what does bad faith mean? What's an adjudicator going to look at? They'll look at for the following. If the employee was not subject to the appropriate standard of performance, they will find bad faith. Second point, if the standards of performance weren't clearly communicated to the employee in terms of what they were required to meet for satisfactory performance, that's also bad faith. And finally, if you didn't provide the employee with the proper tools, training, and mentoring required to meet the standard of performance in a reasonable period of time, that would also lead to a decision of bad faith. So as a manager, what does that mean for you in terms of assessing performance? And Kayla, if we can go to the next slide. Specifically, three things. This comes from a recent decision called DUSA that was rendered in 2020, so earlier this year. So the three things you should be asking yourself as a manager when you're going through the performance management process for anyone, but in particular situations where you're dealing with performance that's not satisfactory, are the following. Were the work objectives that have been set, are they reasonable, and have they been communicated clearly in advance? Second, any performance indicators that have been established, are they reasonable, and have they been communicated clearly and in advance? And finally, has all the support that's required for the employee, by support we mean tools, accommodation measures, training, mentoring, anything that would assist the employee to meet their work objectives and the performance indicators, were they set within the time frame? Have they been provided? And if you can answer positively yes to those three questions, then I think it would be fair to say that the process to evaluate the employee's performance is reasonable. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, and Kayla, if we can go to the next slide. In terms of dealing with an employee whose performance is unsatisfactory, I would not wish it upon you. It is probably one of the most difficult things that you're going to deal with as a manager. Not easy. The process itself sounds relatively straightforward and simple, but it's not. So 5 steps. We tried to break it down into simple, digestible chunks. So 5 steps. The first step and probably the last step are probably the most important. The first step is to prepare, to talk to the employee. Prepare. Preparation is key. There are a wealth of questions that you can ask yourself before you prepare to speak to the employee. They can be broken down into, I guess, 3 general categories, which are as follows. First one is, what do you think the issue is with respect to the employee's performance? Second would be, what do you think the origin or the cause of it is? And finally, what steps or what plan of action would you put together or do you think can be taken to address the issues with the performance? Now, you may be asking yourself, why is preparation so important? And the answer is relatively simple. If you go into these situations unprepared, you're going to set yourself up to fail in terms of this process. For example, and I'm going to pick on myself for a second here. I'm going to have a discussion with my boss, and my boss is having issues with the way that I prepare and conduct myself in presentations, such as this one. And so he'll come up to me and he'll say, if he's not prepared, he'll come up to me and he'll say, Brian, your performance in the last presentation was not acceptable. A typical human response would be, what are you talking about? Of course it is. It's fine. Do you have an example? If I'm not prepared and I don't have examples and I cannot speak to, as a manager, if you can't speak to what the issues are concretely, you're going to be met with resistance. I think it's human nature and it's only natural. Nobody likes to receive negative feedback. So the better prepared you are, the better prepared you are to speak to specific examples and instances. I'm not going to say that the conversation is going to be easier, but it'll be easier to at least address the issues. The second step is to meet with the employee. And the purpose of meeting with the employee and the goal, essentially, is to hear from the employee what they believe the issue is, if they believe that there's an issue, and to get their side of the story and their version in terms of, like I said, what the issue is, what may be the contributing factors to the issue, and what they believe can be done to address any issues that have been identified. Like I said, these discussions are not easy, but it is important to. This step's important because you want to hear from the employee themselves. You want to hear from them and take the time to hear their side of the story. We're often asked whether it's. So we work in the. I'll take a step back. We work in the world of rights and. Obligations, and so we're often asked the question: does the employee have the right to be accompanied by either a union representative or a friend or someone else to these meetings to discuss performance? In terms of rights and responsibilities, so in my world, in the world that I work in, rights and responsibilities come from generally laws or collective agreements. And as far as I know, most collective agreements do not afford employees the right to be accompanied to discuss performance matters. Having said that, it doesn't have to be a definitive no all the time. There may be situations where it would make sense to have the employee accompanied by, be it a union representative, a bargaining agent representative, or another colleague. If you're going to do that, a couple of pointers for you or suggestions. One, before that meeting, you want to clearly outline the roles and responsibilities. Again, keeping in mind that the purpose of this meeting and this discussion is for you and the employee to have a frank discussion and exchange ideas in terms of what the outstanding issues are with respect to performance, and perhaps work on addressing how to address them. So you want to hear from the employee themselves. Not to say that, so again, you want to clearly outline roles and responsibilities. In certain situations, it may be the employee may feel more comfortable having a bargaining agent representative or a colleague bring up certain subjects, and that's fine. But again, ideally you'd like to hear from the employee themselves. If you are going, like I said, the second point is with respect to meeting with the employee and being accompanied is if they're going to bring someone along, i.e. a bargaining agent representative, good idea for you to give your labor relations advisor a call and have them attend as well. In terms of the third step, once you've met with the employee and you've heard their side of the story and you've had a discussion, you want to work on developing a plan to address the performance issues or the goals or the objectives or what have you. The plan should be developed in collaboration with the employee. That was the whole purpose of meeting with them. Easier to get buy-in in terms of whatever plan of attack you develop if you collaborate with the employee with respect to that. Fourth, you want to follow up. Follow-up should be done relatively soon after the meeting and frequently. So that leads to the fifth step, which is you're going to repeat. I should say, in all the years that I've been doing this, it's very rare that you end up in a situation where you've gone through these steps and everything's been addressed in terms of issues with respect to an employee's performance. You're going to, more than likely, you're going to need to repeat the steps. So as I started with respect to the 5-step approach, it is certainly not easy. It does take some time, which is outlined or evident by step number 5, repeating the steps. Like I said, hopefully you don't have to, you'll never end up in this situation, but if you do end up in this situation, following the 5-step approach will certainly hopefully make your lives a little easier as managers. Thanks. That's all I have, Christopher.
Thanks so much, Brian. Interesting, right? We've the first couple of presenters talked to us about how we can support our employees, how we can look after them, give them the tools they need. But I think it's important to recognize that sometimes we are going to have an employee that just for a variety of reasons is not performing. So it's good to have a foundation, it's good to have the rules, and it's good to understand what our obligations as managers are and how we have to deal with this. So I think that's very helpful. Brian started off talking about things being reasonable. I really see a link with that, with the flexible that we talked about earlier. Things like this are rarely black and white, and we have to use the opportunity not only to get the employee to look at how they're performing, but maybe look at the way we as managers are doing our evaluation. So I think that's helpful. And the steps that Brian outlined: prepare, listen, and follow up. Yeah, don't go in without being ready. Follow up, don't just leave it there. But I think the key one, especially, and this goes to supporting employees, is be ready to support them, because they may tell you something that you're not expecting. You may think you provided them the tools, maybe you haven't, or maybe they see things differently. And then the idea of, how's the employee seeing the situation? It's really easy to fall into the trap of, I'm the boss, this is the way it is, and the employees have a different look, especially if you look at it in the context of what we've been living through for the past 6 months. Anything but normal, right? Great, thanks so much, Brian. So we've had a couple of presentations. We're going to move into the next part of our event for this afternoon. We've got some scenarios. So Brian's going to step out for a little bit. He'll be back to join us for the question period at the end, which is fantastic. And now we've got 2 more experts joining us. So we're going to look at these 3 scenarios from the point of view of the manager, from the point of view of the employer, and from the point of view of the bargaining agent. So for the employer, we've got Kathleen and Christopher to stay with us. For the manager's perspective, we have Jennifer Conlon joining us. Jennifer, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Thanks very much. My name is Jennifer Conlon, Chris. I am Director of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. I'm primarily working in IT, and I'm also the co-chair of AFC's Managers Community, so I'm very excited to be here.
Christopher, you're on mute.
Okay, I'm no longer on mute. Thanks, Kathleen. Return the favor. Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. I repeat myself. And now we have, from the bargaining agent perspective, Andrew Beck is joining us. Andrew, introduce yourself, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. My name is Andrew Beck. I'm a case management officer with the Public Service Alliance of Canada. I've held a variety of roles there, all involved in representing employees before the Federal Public Service Labor Relations and Employment Board. You got it right, Brian.
Okay, my computer's a little slow. The mute doesn't come off that quick today. All right, thanks, Andrew. So I'll present scenarios, then we'll get the different perspectives. So imagine I'm a manager coming to you with an issue, and here's what I'm going to say to you folks. I manage a team of 5 employees. 4 employees work remotely, and 1 must work in the downtown office for operational reasons. How do I manage performance remotely and in the workplace in a fair and consistent manner? So let's hear from the manager perspective. Jennifer, any thoughts?
Thanks, Chris. So for some of our managers, leading remote teams is relatively new and only came about as a result of the pandemic. So regardless, I think if you have many years of experience managing remote teams or as a remote worker, I'd have to say that starting off by attempting to build trust through transparency in your decision-making is really important, so that teams feel like they're supported, that you're delegating work in a fair and consistent manner, and that we have a balance in terms of the distribution of that work. So I would suggest that this starts day 1 when you meet your team, when you're onboarding a new employee, well before any discussions on performance, in order to sort of go on when, and start off from, I guess, the right position. The notion of sort of ongoing care and nurturing of our teams is in fact a large part of the manager's responsibility. and we want to sort of go forward and start off on the right foot. It might look different perhaps to everyone, so getting to know your employees, their preferences, when we're meeting and engaging together, let's say on a file, do they like to meet face-to-face? Do we use some of our new digital collaboration tools such as M365? Do they have a preference for phone or email? Really understanding sort of, what makes them tick and where their interests lie as well, I think is really helpful in starting this discussion. It's also important to ensure that our interactions are fair and consistent. So whether we're meeting with someone remotely or in person, again, making sure that we're having an equal experience across that dynamic. Setting smart objectives is probably another area that I'd suggest focusing on. So ensuring that, again, we've heard performance indicators are clear, that they're aligned with business priorities, and that there's a really concerted effort here to make sure that employees understand. It really shouldn't be a fear-based exercise. There's a practicality to it, so it's not something that managers should shy away from. We also feel that consulting employees is really important, so especially if you're the new manager coming into this team, so take the time to discuss how those objectives can be achieved. You can offer your ideas. I'm sure if you're joining a new team, your team has, perhaps has some experience in that area, that would be quite valuable to hear from. Building on employees' strengths and talents is probably another area, that also helps enhance our performance. Providing those constructive feedback opportunities as we can, more than just perhaps employee recognition and more just the constructive feedback aspect, but definitely an interest and appreciation perhaps across the continuum. So make sure that employees understand how important the work is that they do, how it fits into the organization or the business or service that you're offering. So making those linkages and ensuring that there's context will create that meaning and that connection for employees and managers. And finally, I think I'll add, having those conversations throughout the year is helpful, not only at the performance time, but during other opportunities. Again, we're in a situation that's really unprecedented, so this offers an opportunity to connect with employees regularly and stay ahead of all of this in the context of performance. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. Turn it over to you now, Andrew. Can you give us the perspective from the bargaining agents, please?
Absolutely. And thankful to be invited to speak to this audience. I know you are the managers in the public service, so you're also employees, so I'm sure some of this will be things that you've experienced as well. The real critical piece to this question in particular, I think, is how much the playing field has changed. If you're now dealing with remote work, we're dealing with a different office environment for each employee. Are you taking the time to understand how that new workplace looks for each employee? Some may have school-aged children like myself, some may not. And are you staying sort of day to day and maybe week to week and maybe hour to hour aware of the conditions in that workplace and managing expectations in a realistic way, in a way that's an ongoing discussion with your employees about their capacity, about the tools that they have in that new environment, and working with them to ensure that as quickly and effectively as possible, they're able to get the resources they need to perform. The one thing I wanted to address is and I think it is being provided in the materials that will be provided after the presentation, but there's a national standard on mental health that was put out by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and that's a worthwhile resource to check in with, particularly now. I think I'm also very appreciative that early on the challenges of systemic racism and systemic discrimination and dealing with the mental health and well-being of employees was raised. That is a big part, I hope, for managers in dealing with performance management, is ensuring the well-being of employees and ensuring that they're in the best position possible to perform from that perspective. So I hope that if you haven't reviewed that national standard already, that you do so. And then the rest is, I think, echoing comments others have made. It's about transparent, clear expectations that are flexible, that it's you're not limited to simply the steps that are in the performance management directive, that it is also an ongoing, informal, day-to-day review and a discussion with your employees and understanding the situation that they may be dealing with. And obviously that's going to vary hugely and be for sure a difficult job at times, as Brian mentioned. But the real key, I think, ongoing, consistent, clear objectives and clear feedback are going to lead to success more often than not.
Great, thanks very much, Andrew. And now let's hear from Kathleen and Christopher with the employer's perspective.
Sure, I can get started. Definitely agree with my colleagues. Really, transparency and consistency are key. So ensuring that all your employees know how you and your department are going to be managing performance this year at a distance, and in those of you working back in the work site, really important that they are clear and understand how that's going to go. So performance management discussions, whether it's by videos or certain bilats, info, all of that needs to be shared with them so they understand what to expect. Ensure that the objectives and the performance indicators are fair and consistent. So you may team up with fellow managers who does similar work to try to draft and review your team's objectives together so that you're using a more cohesive approach. Same thing with performance indicators. It's also a great practice to consult with the employees themselves prior to finalizing the objectives and performance indicators. Should the objectives or indicators vary dramatically amongst employees, well, please provide explanations to the employees as to why you have a different result that you're looking for. When you're assessing performance or working with your employees, try to be conscious of the unconscious, seems ironic, the unconscious biases that may filter through with your interactions or your assessment of the situation. For instance, an affinity bias, so interacting with more with employees who have similar interests and thus providing them with more support or insight in a particular project, or maybe an age-related bias, feeling you don't relate to someone, or assuming that an experienced employee won't be able to provide innovative and new ideas, and therefore your expectations are lowered or the project's not properly assigned. So try to continue to set up team meetings, encourage collaboration, regular interactions, build that peer support network as well, now more than ever, and keep open to making time for individual meetings for that one-on-one feedback.
Great, thanks, Kathleen. Christopher, anything to add?
The only thing I would add is that we have included a lot of our tools and tips, tricks, and those kinds of things on GCpedia that will touch upon many of the items that were mentioned from my colleagues.
Okay, great. Thanks, Christopher. I'm seeing some consistency starting to develop across the messaging we're getting here. One, just pick up on Christopher's last point there, GCpedia. Lots of resources for you. So we've got this session today live. You can interact, somewhat live, you can interact virtually with our panelists. But there's also resources like GCpedia. There's a couple of people mentioned their labor relations officers. There's lots of support for you. A couple of key things on this is, I think the idea that managing virtual staff is new for a lot of us, at least on the scale that it's suddenly happening. I think it's really important that Andrew's point about getting to know what each individual's needs and new circumstances are. I was in a meeting with a colleague the other day. The Teams meeting came on, and there he is with an infant in one of those little papoose things, sound asleep, and we were talking quietly. And we have to get past this almost artificial division between work and home, and maybe that's the silver lining in this pandemic, is we can see each other as humans as well as just employees and colleagues. So lots of good points there. Thanks for the reference for the National Standard on Mental Health as well. Again, We always know that it's important for employees to be healthy, but it's good to know there's a reference there, and people have written down what healthy looks like and how we should get there. So excellent. Let's jump on to the second scenario now. Here it is. My team is responsible for delivering a program not deemed critical during the pandemic. So in the first days of the pandemic, a lot of stuff was kind of turned off in favor of the really, really important stuff. But then it gradually came back online. So we've had some changes here. Not deemed critical. Our senior manager is contemplating shifting our business goals to support a priority being handled by another division. How do I set performance objectives during these uncertain times? All right, let's jump to you, Jennifer, from the manager's perspective.
So we are hearing from managers that it is a bit of a new situation. There's a lot of changes that they've had to make to not only the way that they're working, but also to the work that they're doing, either to support external Canadians or to internal colleagues. So realigning the work that we do may be a new requirement. But it's also possible that these types of changes are impacting our team. So maybe we're seeing an increase in stress or an increase around the uncertainty or the ambiguity of the change that's going to happen. So from a manager's perspective, again, we're coming back to the notion of communication being key. We really need to ensure that our employees are aware the priorities that are changing and why. Let's make sure that this is done as early as possible so that your teams are not the last ones to know. The context of the change really needs to be well understood as well, and providing that time, that room and space for employees to ask questions and discuss the impact, I think is also really, really helpful. We need to be empathetic in our response. What impacts one employee, perhaps more specifically, may impact another employee or a team in a vastly different way. And so again, really understanding your teams, where they're at, how they're reacting to this potential change is definitely part of setting up those new objectives. In some situations, we've seen that the perceived poor performance is actually due to a lack of understanding, again, on the part of the employee about the change in direction or business priority. So as managers, we really play an important role in supporting our teams to provide this clarity as early as we possibly can. With respect to setting those objectives in uncertain times, we need to make sure that direction is clear. So again, we come back to the notion of SMART objectives, creating the linkage between the why and the what. And again, you may need to continue to revisit those objectives that you set as your organization moves forward and more information becomes known as we move through the pandemic together. To help communicate those objectives, we want to see managers document that. We want to make sure that those deadlines, the changes of approach, and also the work accomplished to date is captured. Make sure that there's visibility, that it's clear for all, and check in with employees to to measure the clarity and adjust the messaging as needed. So just to make sure that everyone has the same understanding of what needs to be accomplished in the particular timeframes as your business and organization is also changing. There really is some amazing work that managers are undertaking, often outside the pandemic, but also in these unprecedented times. So we really want to make sure that managers are acknowledging the good work that their teams are doing. Employee engagement is also important. And again, if an employee is not able to finish a task and has to reprioritize, sometimes that takes a little bit of extra time. So looking at the engagement, looking at the motivation is also a factor. And I think that the final aspect that I'll share is really taking care of yourself as a manager. So I think oftentimes, we're saddled with the responsibility of taking care of our teams. We are encouraging managers really to make sure that they take care of their own health and well-being. So consulting with the services that are offered to you in the department and preparing yourself to have these courageous conversations. Look to mentoring, coaching your peers, other people who've gone through similar situations. There's definitely no shortage of services that are available to managers. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. And we'll go over to Andrew again for the bargaining agent perspective. What do you think, Andrew?
Thanks. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of repeating, actually. So I think what I want to highlight is one of the things that strikes me about a situation like this is we all take a lot of pride in the work we do. And so having something that you're working on shift to something else, there is a period of probably adjustment for a lot of employees, depending on how engaged, how personal a project was to them, to learn that that project is no longer a priority. Now we're going to shift to something else. Like, recognize that there's an emotional component to having work shifted and to being asked to engage on something else on short notice. And I think it's, especially in this context, it's pretty expected to be that short notice might be part of the new normal. And just be transparent. This is a decision that was made. We are shifting. I've just learned this. Share that with your team as early as possible, so that they're in the loop as things change, as the ground shifts under everybody. They're not feeling as if they're the last to know. And then ensuring that the tools necessary to meet the new objectives are being provided. If there's new training, new skills that are required, and here I am repeating what Jennifer just said, but mentoring, peering, link them with the people in the other team, ensure that there's the ability for your team to now step up and fill this new objective in a good way. And then in terms of rights and responsibilities, Jennifer mentioned, make sure that you understand yours. For the employee, the bargaining agent, if they're represented by a union, their bargaining agent and their bargaining agent representatives are there in part, in addition to representing them, but to explaining their rights and responsibilities. So make sure that they're aware that they can reach out to if they have questions about their own rights and responsibilities. Is this part of my work description? Speak to your steward, speak to somebody on your local executive if you have questions about that, and stay engaged in that discussion. But I think those are the points that I would highlight.
Okay, great. Thanks, Andrew. And now we'll look for the employer perspective. Kathleen and Christopher, over to you.
Why don't I let Christopher go first this time?
Thanks, Kathleen. I don't really have anything to add. Everything I've heard resonates certainly with our world. I would just add, looking at the key leadership competencies for executives and looking at the different kinds of effective behaviors on how to deal with these kinds of situations could be applicable in this scenario, in terms of communicating with staff, letting them know the shift in priority, reaching out to colleagues, seeing if there are opportunities for innovation, support, and obviously being an empathetic leader, sort of reading the team, understanding how they're feeling, and having conversations with them either within the performance management cycle or outside of the performance management cycle are expectations of leaders, and those are very clearly defined in our key leadership competencies.
Yeah, and I'd just add, as we've said many times, the H in HR is for human. So really, you have to be mindful of your people, their needs. As mentioned, it can be crushing to suddenly feel that your organization no longer values your key work. That's not the case at all. It's a shifting of priorities, but the people doing the work are absolutely valued. And so, again, use this opportunity to be flexible, to show empathy, look at creative ways to get things done, and really try to help your team be involved in setting these objectives. See from them what are the important parts and help them really set the stage for how we're going to get this done and what are we trying to accomplish together. Be a part of the situation so it's not feeling like something's happening to them, but they're being a part of something. Really build that engagement. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. One of the things that strikes me from this scenario is that in some ways it's just a typical change management problem for a manager or for an employee to go through things. But I'm thinking in terms, if we'd ever presented this 6 months ago or 8 months ago as a case study in one of the school's courses, they would have said, no, that's just way too much. That would never, ever happen. We would never need to deal with this much change. So it's in a way, it's nice to see that the processes that the federal government, the public service has put in place over the years actually work. There's some really key things there. Is, I love the point we take pride in our work, and it can be an emotional wrench when we're asked to change our projects and face in a different direction. And we have to recognize that. This idea of being clear in our communication and letting people know why and why their work still has value. I think that's fantastic. And I think it was you, Christopher, that said an empathetic leader. 20 years ago, that phrase would not have existed because, you know, the human part of the human resources wasn't the important part. It was the resource part. I'm really glad to see that shift. All right, let's move on to the third scenario now. Where's my third? There it is. My employee's performance is slowly decreasing to the point that it is becoming an issue and is having an impact on the rest of the team. How do I manage this situation? Once again, Jennifer, let's start with you.
So from a manager's perspective, we really want to encourage our leaders to use an empathetic approach. So as managers, we need to identify the root of the issue, starting with an assessment of the situation that's very much fair, transparent, and free from biases. If we're not the right person to have that conversation because of that circumstance, then we should recognize that and get the help and support that we need. And employees need to know that they have someone in their court, someone to turn to, and especially in a situation where we're all working in this pandemic. These are very real personal factors that are at play in employees' lives. So we need to be prepared to support our teams in an authentic way. A couple of, I guess, examples that would come to mind, definitely starting off with having a discussion. So engaging and communicating to dig further. If employees are open to, of course, having a discussion. Perhaps it's a situation of an individual who's typically a top performer who's now disengaged. So let's find out why. In some situations, assigning more responsibilities or perhaps providing a bit of a change in a project can actually lead to better performance. So really this engagement and discussion is part of our first step. In other circumstances, perhaps an employee is assigned work that really doesn't make him or her truly satisfied or happy. Maybe their job has evolved. Maybe they've acquired the skill sets and no longer have an interest in the work. Or perhaps they require additional skills in order to optimize their contribution for a particular project. It could be a single and specific particular issue that could be addressed. Maybe it's just clarification on an objective to improve performance. And sometimes employees don't have, obviously, the understanding that they're not performing, and that leads into perhaps a more difficult conversation that we need to have in a way that keeps managers engaged and connected with their teams. Right? The goal isn't to cast aside. The goal is to really get them back on track and do this in an empathetic way that really builds trust. Another area I would suggest exploring is with respect to possible issues and barriers around my own communication as a manager. So am I not delivering messages clearly? Am I not setting the expectations on how the work is to be delivered? So maybe there's a bit of a 360 that we can get from our teams. And again, having that close communication will get us the honest, transparent feedback that we need. I'd look at other barriers that could potentially exist. Is it a lack of tools? Are there circumstances where we have perhaps a new employee coming into the organization where additional training or spending some time understanding priorities might be important to get them back on track? And perhaps for more senior or experienced employees, maybe they need a little bit of greater responsibility. And again, going back to new projects and new initiatives where we can, something that perhaps would be more stimulating. So I think diving in as a manager and finding out solutions in partnership with the employee as part of that root cause analysis is really important before a situation in poor performance really has potential negative consequences on the entire group and the entire organization. And then you're dealing with something that perhaps is going to take much more time to resolve. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Jennifer. Andrew, what are your thoughts on this one?
Yeah, so again, from a bargaining agent's perspective, almost looking at this from the inverse is if somebody's come to us and we're representing them and they're saying, I'm being managed for poor performance right now, we're looking at the questions of, are they being provided with all the tools that they need to perform their job? Especially during this time, those tools might include, like the home office environment. I think I approach this scenario. This is not, we've all probably had circumstances where we've not turned in our best work, but our performance is generally good. You know, this one, it wasn't my best memo in the world. This is somebody we're seeing like consistent declining performance. And so, you know, things we talked about earlier, like clear and ongoing communication is something that's going to lead to some prevention from a situation like this becoming a surprise, because I think the most difficult place that both the manager and the employee could end up in is where a conversation like this is a surprise. And from an employee, they're going to be feeling serious pressure. If you are having a conversation with your manager about ongoing poor performance, it is a short road to go from that to my job is at risk. And that's a really scary, difficult place, obviously, for an employee to be. So not ending up in a situation where that discussion is a surprise. There should be, you know, if it is, as the scenario outlines, a slow progression or a slow decline in the performance, that this has been something that's been raised. So, you know, back to the things we're assessing, you know, has there been a shift in the workload? Has there been appropriate adjustments of deadlines for the work that was intended to be performed before all the circumstances changed? Has the work been reassessed in light of the shifting circumstances? Has that employee's feedback been solicited in respect of their the expectations for what they're going to produce? And have the objectives, performance indicators been set with that employee, reset if necessary as part of that evaluation of the ongoing work, and discussed with the employee during that reassessment? And you know, have you pointed the employee towards resources that might assist them, whether tools and training, or the employee assistance program, or other tools to support the well-being of an employee? And is there a plan to move from where you are back to the performance that's expected from that employee? And is that employee engaged in developing that plan and seeing that you are there to support them in getting back to a place where they are making, you know, valuable contributions? And those would be the keys to me. But I really, speaking from experience, I often don't see the performance management stuff because it doesn't rise to the level of the Federal Public Service Labor Relations and Employment Board very often. Where it does, there's a surprise in there somewhere. At some point, there was a miscommunication or a misalignment of understandings. And so avoiding that in the first place is probably the most key thing I could say from the bargaining agent's perspective.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. And we'll round this scenario out with opinions from the employer. Kathleen, Christopher?
Sure. So again, a lot of great points raised by both Jennifer and by Andrew. Really, it makes sense, and it's absolutely worthwhile to take the time to figure out what is at the root of this change in performance. So maybe an employee who is thriving in the office is really just not able to find their way while working remotely. So take the time to find out what are the barriers to them being able to achieve, being able to deliver. So I'm happy to steer you to the directive on duty to accommodate that you could find on the Canada.ca website, which will really help to explain the employer's responsibilities and roles. And there's a lot of flexibility that exists already. Even just hours of work might maybe be adjusted by switching when the employee is achieving pieces, or making sure that they have the right tools, as we've mentioned many times as well, to get the work done. Taking that time to make sure they understand exactly what we're expecting of them. If they want to go through it again and hear it in a different way, explain it, like give them the fair chance to get started on that. Additionally, if after all your investment, if it's still not working out, again, on GC Intranet, you can look through the performance improvement plan instructions to sort of, again, examine all those indicators and to help analyze performance objectively so that you can really work on not just diagnosing what's going wrong, but to help them through and hopefully be able to achieve a better outcome.
I mean, I don't have anything to add really, except for maybe one plug for the documents that we've posted on GCpedia and guidance, where we have scenarios, kinds of tips on how to write certain performance evaluations and those kinds of things. And maybe just looking at those proactively so you can get ahead of those situations and then approach them in a prepared and empathetic manner. You're on mute, Christopher.
Mute again. It's sneaky, this mute button. All right. But I'm great. I love the support I'm getting from my colleagues on the panel here. I see them waving at me, so I know I'm not being heard. Thanks, guys. Excellent tour of dealing with this scenario. It's interesting how certain things come up time and again when we're dealing with, well, fellow human beings. The idea of being transparent, communicating, and checking your own biases, asking, do I have barriers to communication? Am I the cause as a manager of their not performing? Giving them the tools to address. I think these are really, really important. And this idea of digging to find out what the root is and recognizing that we've got some serious changes underway for everybody, and it's going to affect different employees differently. So thank you for that, everyone. We're going to move into the question and answer period. We've actually had quite a number of questions come in. I'll be honest with you, I don't know if we'll have time for all of them. You can still submit a question, but I won't go out on a limb and promise that everybody is going to have their questions answered. So I'm going to start with an easy one. Somebody writes, what's the difference between a performance improvement plan and an action plan? I think we'll just give that one to you, Kathleen, because I think I know what the answer is.
Sure. So this is the term we're using now under our new policy. So it's really of a more positive people focus to try to give employees the chance to improve.
Okay, thanks. Couple of, I'm going more or less in order. Some of the questions have been answered already. There's a number of questions on resources and tips and tricks. I think we've covered that. There's the GCpedia page. You can always contact OCRO or through your own human resources people to steer you in the right direction for support. Somebody asks, what is considered a reasonable, there's that word reasonable, what is a reasonable amount of time to allow for training, mentoring, et cetera, in the case of unsatisfactory performance? I think that's a good question because it talks about giving them the chance to improve, but we don't want that stereotypical case of somebody who's been an underperformer for 20 years, right? So who wants to jump in with that one?
I can dive in first.
Go ahead, Brian.
So it'll depend on the objective and the performance indicators, right? And the type of job. There isn't a concrete, hard and fast rule in terms of, 12 months is a reasonable amount of time or 6 months is a reasonable amount of time. Like I said, it'll depend on what the objective is, what the issue is with respect to performance. Is it something that's, if it's something that's, can be easily, I don't want to say corrected, but easily addressed, the time period may be shorter. But if it's depending on the nature of work, and I'm thinking in particular of, some research type positions, the objectives might be a year and a half long. So to give an employee 6 months to address that issue would obviously be unreasonable. So it'll depend. Again, generally speaking, and I'll let my colleagues jump in as well. What we advise is to err on the side of taking a little longer or giving a little longer in order to achieve the objective, then kind of, push the envelope and try and speed things up.
Hey, thanks, Brian. Anybody else want to jump in on that one?
I'll jump in and just say that the length of time it might take, it's probably one of the things you want to discuss as part of that managing and saying, and on an ongoing way, if you're providing training, after a month, talk about how the training's going, and continue to do that. And you may have modify how you expect that training go depending on all kinds of other circumstances. I'm sure that if you were managing somebody's performance in November of 2019, you might right now be changing the timeline for managing that performance given what we're dealing with. So let that be flexible and part of the conversation.
It tricked me. It muted on its own this time. I'd already undone it. The technology's out to get me. So thanks for that. Any other comments on this one, or should we move on to the next question? Okay. So there's a question here. Examples of poor performance relate to work objectives, which are a little easier to identify when they're not met. What about if someone is not meeting the core competencies? Has the subjectivity of evaluating core competencies ever come up as an issue? So panelists, do you see a difference in the way we evaluate core competencies versus performance objectives?
If I could just start.
Go.
The core competencies are very important. So the objectives are tailored and customized, but these core competencies are ones we all share because we've all agreed on how we plan to work together. And results are important, but how we get there matters. So if you're a terrible human being and you're leaving a trail of desperately sad colleagues in your wake, don't care that you got that great result. It really is just as important the how you achieve results. So that's a really important part of the discussion as well. And it's a delicate one as well, because a lot of times people are totally not self-aware how their behavior impacts others. So similar to the efforts to reduce harassment complaints, one of the key pieces is empowering people to have those respectful conversations to let others know how their impacts affect them. So many departments, well, they should all be well equipped with informal conflict management teams who can help equip you with the tools to have those delicate conversations. Because each piece, like we can all be individuals in how we're trying to build and achieve things, and we have great skills and pieces that make us unique. But at the end of the day, our behaviors are expected to be at a certain standard, and we have to really hold people to account on that one.
Yeah, well said, Kathleen. I've talked a lot about the key leadership competencies. Those are built into the performance management process for executives. It's very clear in terms of the 6 key leadership competencies, the effective and ineffective behaviors that are highlighted in that document, which can be very, very important when it comes to managing performance and providing feedback to executives who are either demonstrating the key leadership competencies or not. So, yes, very important.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Christopher. Does anybody else have a comment on this one? Go ahead, Andrew.
Particularly on the part of that question talking about has the subjectivity of the assessment ever come up? For sure, we see it. I would say, like what Kathleen said, this is something that everyone is assessed on in the public service. So if you're managing an employee and you're identifying like their behavior in the workplace is problematic. Are they new to the public service? Have they been here a long time? And if they've been here a long time, why are you the first manager to see this? Like, is this something, there's a track record there? And that, for me, would be a place to touch base with your own biases and determine, is this something I'm seeing? Is it something particular about our relationship, this employee and myself? Or is it something that other previous managers have just let it ride, and now this employee is going to get a surprise from you that their behavior maybe all along has been problematic, but you're the first one to come up and tell them. And so there's a lot of, I think probably difficulties in dealing particularly with the core competencies. And so a few of the things that I can say anecdotally I've seen and that I would look to.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. The recurring theme in some of your comments about problems, if you look into it, there's a surprise somewhere in the history. And that dovetails nicely with why we need to be transparent and why we need to communicate clearly and ask questions. So great, thanks, guys. I'm going to jump on to the next one here. I think this is somebody who's really looking to get some clarity on how do we balance what the rules say, because rules are important, and how do we build in that flexibility that every one of you has mentioned so far? So they talk about the collective agreement stating that work hours is 7.5 during a day between 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. And then he or she goes on to write, yet we are also being told that we managers must be flexible in terms of hours. The message seems to be that employees can work beyond the core hours and not work consecutive hours. Does this messaging then trump what is in the collective agreement? It can be more difficult to manage performance when someone's hours and availability is inconsistent. There's a lot of challenges in that one question. Any thoughts? Because there's some key things here. Who wants to go first?
I guess I can go
for
first.
It, Brian.
I can try. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question. So I would say, and Andrew, if I put my foot in my mouth, please jump in at any point in time. And same thing to the rest of my colleagues. Generally speaking, we try to respect the collective agreement. So obviously that would supersede everything. In terms of the flexibility, I can say, working at Oak Grove, the message to the public service has been, look, we're in a situation that has been unprecedented. We have employees that may not be able to work their standard, 7 to 3 or 9 to 5. If they are willing to come forward and work, hours outside of the standard core hours, do not discourage it if that's something that they are willing to do. Are we imposing it on people? I think I'm confident in saying no, we're certainly not imposing it on people, but we're encouraging it for people who are who may be in difficult situations or situations where they're not able to meet their standard work weeks and what have you. So that would be the first message. I don't recall the rest of the questions, so perhaps I'll stop there and I'll let my colleagues jump in. But yeah, generally speaking, the message and the intent has been, we want to respect the collective agreement, but we are cognizant of the fact that we're trying to remain flexible so that employees can contribute meaningfully to the workplace, even if it's outside their regular hours of work.
If I could just add in there as well, there are so many references, yes, to flexibility right now, and definitely we do not want to impose something on others, but we also, as managers, if we can use our skills, and it's part of the pieces of managing a virtual team. Some of you already have managed teams who are in different time zones, so you're already having to be flexible and having an understanding with the employees about, here's my expectations for you. If I need to reach you, here's the time. We're setting up predetermined times as to when you'll have status updates on what's going on, so that you're feeling still confident that the work is being achieved. But if the employee is calmer doing so after your normal hours, but still has it for you when you need, it just makes sense to try to accommodate where possible. So many kinds of accommodations, certainly, yes, flexible hours being one of the big ones. But some employees are going to be asking to work in the workplace again soon. There's all kinds of different things to help them achieve that success. So definitely, yes, the collective agreement it's a binding contract. That's our obligations we've committed to. But if the employee themselves are asking for special accommodations, it is worthwhile trying to tap into those great skills. And I know the school has a wealth of material on on virtual team management. So I really encourage you to have a look at that, and it'll help you get more comfortable with finding ways and having a respectful discussion with the employee to see what your expectations can be. And you can always revisit it if it's not working well. But if that's what they need to realign, then I encourage you giving it a try.
Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks. It's a question about the collective agreement, so I have to answer. I agree with what's been said. I certainly hope that nobody's trying to violate the collective agreement, and I certainly understand that to be the case. The piece I would add to what's been said is, if you and an employee discuss coming to some agreement that this is what works for me, I'm going to report to you, I'll send this email this time of night tonight, just be explicit about, like, this is, you're outside the bounds of the collective agreement, everyone's agreed. At some point, you may return to the strict rules of the collective agreement, and that's the bottom line. Everybody's right, and just come to an understanding that if you're gonna break certain rules, they should be speaking to their steward, local executive. You should probably be speaking to your labor relations advisor and making sure that, because as much as the collective agreement has a host of thou shalts, there are flexibilities in there as well. And the hours of work clause in the collective agreements in the public service are pages long. And so you may think you're violating the collective agreement. Have a discussion. Maybe there are frameworks within the collective agreement that will allow you to achieve the flexibilities that you want to. That's not a straightforward clause of the collective agreement. So, try to fit it within the collective agreement first. If you can't, and it works for you and the employee, understand that you are agreeing to go outside of that, and understand that either of you may return to those rules at any point. So long as that's clearly communicated, I think you're in good shape.
Okay, thanks for that nuance there, Andrew. I think that's important because we talk about flexibility. We want to make sure we stay within the rules, but we don't want the rules to become an unnecessary constraint just so we can say we followed the rules. So I think that's good advice. We are getting close to the end of our time, but there's one more question that's popped up that I think we want to address. I'm going to ask you guys to address it in 30 seconds or less, even though it's a really tough question. So really quickly, how do you suggest dealing with an employee who refuses to acknowledge that they have a performance problem, even when presented with examples, and by refusing to acknowledge the issue, refuses to participate in the measures put in place to help them? So that's a hard one. Quick answer to show us out for the day.
I'm going to give my 30 seconds to Brian.
Teamwork.
Me again. Okay, so 30 seconds or less. One, that sounds like one of those situations where I would call my friend Andrew and say, here's the story. Looking for your help in terms of perhaps identifying if there are some underlying issues here, because the employee, there doesn't seem to be an acknowledgement from the employee. If after having done that, you're able to break past that, great. If not, then I would say just very quickly, generally speaking, you want to give your LR people a call and continue down that road if the employee appears to be, in my words, in some form of denial in terms of there being an issue. That's my 30-second answer.
Okay, awesome. Anybody else want 30 seconds?
I'll take 15 and give more to Brian if you need. Just again, have fair evidence, like really respectfully broach this with the employee. Don't make them feel in a position that they have to be on the defensive. Help them see how their actions are impacting others. Again, if they don't see, then do seek extra help. Obviously, they have others trusted people in their bargaining agents who can help support them in seeing the impact of their actions and how that could affect them down the line. And if they do need to have some intervention and begin documenting the situation to again equip them to get back on track, hopefully, but they do need to be made aware of how their actions impact others and the overall organization.
We have provided lots of opportunities through our systems and processes to provide that feedback and to make sure that those situations are documented, whether through ETMS and the beginning of the year, mid-year, and year-end touch points throughout the performance management cycle.
Yeah, I would just add to that, managers aren't alone, so there's a wealth of systems and people and processes like our panelists here today that are experts in the field. So don't hesitate to reach out, get some support, so that you can appropriately address the situation in the fairest and most consistent way possible.
Okay, last word to you, Andrew. Everybody else had a go at this one.
Sure. Well, I'm advising the other person in this equation, and if there is a clear documentary trail and I look at the file, I may have a very difficult conversation with that person if everything has been done to support them and provide them with the tools and all the I's have been dots and T's have been crossed, then my advice to them will be difficult advice for them to hear as well.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We are coming to a close for our session today. What a wonderful tour of a slice of how we deal with all the new realities brought on by this pandemic. Some of the key messages that come out is talk to your employees. Figure out where they're coming from. There might be performance issues, there might not. People are in search of clarity. It's up to us as managers and executives to provide that clarity, to provide the support, provide the tools. And as you guys just all mentioned as you went around for this last question, is there's lots of resources there. The school has courses. My colleague has let me know that all the links and references that were mentioned in the session today will be provided to all the participants. So you don't have to do a massive Google search all on your own. We'll provide a good start for you. You do have resources. One of the messages that one of you mentioned, I forget who, but said, you need to take care of yourself. So yeah, we're there to take care of employees, but we need to look after ourselves too. So I think that's worth repeating. A couple of housekeeping remarks before we finish up. Your feedback is important to us. The school exists to provide training and learning for public servants. We like to know what we're doing right, and if there's things we need to improve or things that we've missed, please take the time to fill out that evaluation. And we always make adjustments as a consequence of the comments we hear. Lots more things available. There are courses on performance management. There are courses on difficult conversations. Check GC Campus, check our website. There's lots of information there, and keep your eyes peeled for more events coming up. So once again, marvelous panel, marvelous presenters. Thank you, Tolga. Thank you, Kathleen, Brian, Jennifer, Christopher, Andrew. What a wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again.
Thanks so much.